لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم ولمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون. وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين. وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. وإذا قيل لهم انفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين. ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية إلى أهلهم يرجعون. ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون. قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون واليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة في اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ضلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات محمد وإلى أرواح أمواتنا وأمواتكم وإلى أرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات وشهداء الإسلام رحم الله من قرأ سورة الفاتحة المباركة مسبوقة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome for tonight's program. Inshallah, we're going to continue with our program. Just a couple announcements. We do have children's program in the usual hall in the hall in the Sunday school, old Sunday school hallway. And then we'll continue with our last program for this weekend tomorrow, so same time, starting at the same time. There'll be no program on Sunday. And inshallah, once we are ready, then inshallah we'll invite our speaker, our esteemed leader, Shaykh Salim Yusufali, up with your loudest of salawat. Can I get another 3 loud salawat? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
There's a light that sometimes comes here. Isn't there a light that sometimes comes this way? No, that's not. That's not. Oh. Okay. So there's lights up here. Shima? Oh, okay, thanks. All right. Respected brothers and sisters, yesterday we began this series, this seminar series on the topic of the representation and misrepresentation of Ashura and Karbala. And yesterday I had a chance to explore the topic of how do we know what happened. Now, some of you were asking about the slides. Can we get access to the slides? And the answer is yes, by all means. I put up a QR code here. So if you want to follow along with the slides, you can get access to them by scanning the QR code and then clicking on that link. I will show the QR code again a little bit later, and then you can access them at that time as well in case you miss it this time. So just a quick review of what we covered yesterday. We said that there's the event that took place, and then there are those who survived, people who were the eyewitnesses, and then there were the texts, the manuscripts where these were recorded. We said some of those people are the Ahlul Bayt alayhim assalam themselves, those who were not martyred. And then we had some survivors of combat who were there, they saw everything, but they weren't killed. And later on, they gave their testimonies. They said that this is what we saw. Some of them were from the side of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, some of them were from the enemy side. And we talked about how the first, initially in the 1st to 4th centuries, the goal was to record what happened. And then it became more of like taking different accounts from different reports. And then finally, it switched in later centuries to be like storytelling, because now it was about the art of commemoration and mourning. And when we're looking at what's reliable and what's not reliable, there are some things we can look for. For example, how ancient is the history text that we're referring to? Or if it's a newer text, what is it sourcing back to? And the chain of narrations, and why did that person write that book? Is it for history, or was it just to tell a story? And how do they present the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam? We talked about how the oldest, complete history is that of Abu Mikhnaf, and then after him we have these other histories, including some from historians who are known to be Sunni, and then historians like Shaykh Mufid. He was a scholar, and this is his book of history, and he also mentioned and goes through the history of Karbala. And then we have this turning point around the 10th century. We talked about how it moved to more storytelling, and then we have these other books that introduce some exaggerations. And so we talked about the idea of lisanul hal, where sometimes as a poet or a storyteller, you say something which you're exaggerating, and the person who's listening to you knows that you're exaggerating. And that's okay, because it's a way of making your statements really profound. But what happens is that if we're not careful, sometimes that gets captured into actual what happened. This is where we left off. Okay, so what we're going to do today, inshallah, is we're going to cover some of the, in a little bit more detail, some of the sources that are there. Then we're going to look at an example of one of the events that took place in Karbala and how it's presented by some of the different sources. I want you to see how just a few words here and there can change a whole story, and it can change the way it gets commemorated, even later, and the way people think about it. So we're going to go through an example, and it's going to be the example of Hazrat Qasim alayhi salam. And then if we have time, I'm going to begin, the topic for today, which was the mourning practices. Like, how do we do azadari, and why do we do azadari? Why is it that we do things the way that we do them? So inshallah, that's the goal. I don't know if we're going to get there. So what we're covering right now is some of those sources that are there, that are famous. One of them is called al-luhuf ala qatl al-tufuf. Luhuf means size of sorrow, and tufuf is one of the names of Karbala. Karbala has different names. Nainawa, it has Ard al-Taf, and another name for Karbala is at-Tufuf. So this was a book that was written by Sayyid ibn Tawus. Sayyid ibn Tawus was a very special scholar in the history of Shia scholars. He was extremely pious, extremely spiritual, close to Allah. And one of his most famous books is called Iqbal al-A'mal. Today, when we read our du'as, typically we refer to a book called Mafatihul Jinan. Mafatihul Jinan draws primarily from two sources. One of them is Misbahul Mutahajjid of Shaykh Tusi, and the other one is Iqbal al-A'mal of Sayyid ibn Tawus. So before Mafatihul Jinan was published and became famous, people would carry around, and in their homes they would have Iqbal al-A'mal. Okay, that was the work of Sayyid ibn Tawus. Sayyid ibn Tawus is known to be one of the kummalin, meaning one of those who achieved the highest level of human perfection, other than what a ma'asum can achieve. And he himself narrates in his book how at times he would get special help from the imam of the time. Like, for example, he had some difficult thing that came up in his life, and he did a special tawassul to the imam, and then in his dream he saw something. Some people have said that this book of his, which is called Al-Luhuf, that when he's talking about the history of what happened in Karbala, that a part of it he himself saw in a vision. Some people have said that. He himself doesn't say that. He says that this is what happened, these are the events. But some people say that part of it he was given in a type of mukashafa. Okay, so This book has been given a lot of emphasis from our scholars, like Shahid Ayatollah Khamenei in some of his speeches. He would tell people, he would advise people that if you want to go to one book and you only have time to go to one book, then this is the book that you should go to if you want to refer and get the history of what happened in Karbala. One of the things that's happened is because of the emphasis of our scholars on this book, the different handwritten manuscripts of this book have been examined, and now a version has come out which is the corrected version. After all the different changes and maybe sometimes errors get introduced, they've identified this is the actual text of what was written by Sayyid ibn Tawus. So this book, as I mentioned last night, it is available and translated into English as well. The other books I want to emphasize are two books by Shaykh Abbas Qummi himself. Shaykh Abbas Qummi was, he lived in between 1877 and 1941, so about 100 years ago. Sayyid ibn Tawus lived in 664 after Hijrah, right, which was, maybe 800 years ago. But Shaykh Abbas Qummi is maybe 100 years ago. And his most famous book that we're familiar with is Mafatihul Jinan, but he was a prolific author, and he has many different books in different areas, not just dua, including history as well. And so Shaykh Abbas Qummi has two books in which he covers the history of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in Karbala. One of them is called Nafasul Mahmum. Nafasul Mahmum means the nafas is a breath that you take. Mahmum is somebody who is very sad and grieved. Okay, and in the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they said that if somebody is very distressed and they're very sad because of what happened to the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, to the point where they take a breath, they're like, they take a sigh of sorrow, then the Ahlul Bayt have said that this is a tasbih. Right, this is an act of glorification of Allah. It's a very good thing. It's a type of dhikr of Allah when somebody does that with the right intention. So he wrote his book, he titled it Nafasul Mahmum, and it's about the history of what happened to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Now, this book was written when he was younger. There's another book that he wrote, which is a 2-volume work, which is called Muntahal Amal, that he wrote towards the end of his life. Muntahal Amal is not only a history of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, it's a history of all the Ma'asumin. And recently, it's been translated into English. I can't comment on the quality of the translation, but it is available in English as well. And it's split up by, the Ma'asum in English, and you can go and find the book about Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Now, because it was written later in his life, at this time, Shaykh Abbas Qummi became even more of a profound scholar, because as scholars, the more that they study, the more that they do research, they, in any field, right, they become more expert. So some of the incidents that Shaykh Abbas Qummi mentions in Nafasul Mahmum, in Muntahal Amal, he goes back and he... This is what he said there. Here he says something different. Okay? So sometimes, okay, I don't want to go into details right now. Maybe if there's a Q&A at some point, maybe tomorrow we can set aside time for that if there's interest. But sometimes some people will quote Shaykh Abbas Qummi, and they'll be like, Shaykh Abbas Qummi says this in Nafasul Mahmum, and he says this thing right here, right? And we look at that, we're like, wait a minute, that's different from what, for example, we hear from our marjas, right, about what happened to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. This is where we need to pause and say, well, what did he say in his later book, Muntahal Amal? Did he keep the same thing, or did he change that thing? Okay, and if there's interest, I can go into more details about what's changed. But anyway, both of the books have been recommended by our great scholars, our marjas. But if you want to look at the later one as a starting point, Muntahal Amal, it's a little bit more, because it's written later, it's a little bit more, let's say, accurate or careful in terms of what sources he consults to write that book. Okay, now there are two other books I want to mention here. Both of them are easily available online in English, and a lot of people, when they just search for like history of Imam Hussein, these are the books that will come up. Okay, one of them is called Maqtal al-Hussein by Abdul Razak al-Muqarram, and the other one is called Sugnameh Ali Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's in English it's translated as Lamentations, the Tragedy of the Lord of the Martyrs. This second book used to be available online. It used to be on alislam.org, but I think the publishers, they filed a complaint, and now you can only get it in print form. At least it's not easily available. But it's a lot of people got this book because it was one of those, it looked really good, like the translation and everything. Both of these books were written by great scholars, and these scholars took their effort to compile them. You can see the pictures of the scholars right here. Okay, but their effort, like their goal wasn't to try to produce something which was very authentic. They were like, let's compile something and put it all together. So at times, there are parts where they rely on some of those sources that, don't have historical weight. They're not considered to be very accurate. So, if somebody refers to them, they have to be a little bit careful. Sometimes we come to these and we're like, the approach we take is like, okay, I heard all these stories about, I don't know, Hazrat Qasim or about Ali Akbar alayhi salam, but I don't see them in the book that I'm referring to. I want a book that mentions all the stories. And then sometimes, and I've heard people say this, then like, oh, I found the book, it's Lamentations, right? It has all the stories that I've ever heard. Well, okay, but just because it's a story that we heard doesn't mean that it's something which is necessarily, historically authenticated. So we have to be careful about just taking anything or from anywhere. So, and again, I want to mention, the book of Abu Mikhnaf, and there was one of our contemporary scholars, his name is Ayatollah Hadi Gharavi. He's very famous right now in the Hawza. He, especially in the area of history and hadith texts. So he took the effort, just like a few other scholars and groups of scholars have taken this effort to try to recreate the history of Abu Mikhnaf, which was one of those oldest, histories that was written in the early 2nd century. So just maybe 40 years, 50 years after the events of Karbala. So this book has been published in English. It's called The Event of Taf, and it's something which, is considered to be very reliable. Now, in recent times, we have, this is one of the beauties of the Hawza, that you see that the scholars, are always working and trying to take things to the next level. May Allah give them that tawfiq. So you have two efforts that have taken place in recent times that were done by a group of very educated scholars. And they were able to produce these things which were just quite amazing. One of them is called Tarikh Qiyam wa Maqtal Jami' of Sayyid al-Shuhada. And it's written by a famous historian by the name of Mahdi Pishwayi. He's alive today. And it has, one of the things it does is it goes through all the different sources, and then it recreates the story, but based on the latest research and evidence that we have. And it's done very well in terms of it talks about the different events, takes from the different sources. It also talks about some of the modern doubts that people have brought up and how to respond to them. The other one is by somebody named Marhum Ayatollah Ray Shahri. Ayatollah Ray Shahri is a very famous scholar. He had this institute which was called Darul Hadith, and this institute has done such an incredible job of taking the hadiths of the Ahlul Bayt and then preserving them and presenting them in different collections. I don't know if you've heard of the multiple volume work called Mizanul Hikmah. Mizanul Hikmah, it's in English it's translated as the scale of wisdom. Right? This was done by them. And then after that, so many topics they took and they said that, what do hadith say about this topic? For example, recently I was looking at a book they had about happiness and sadness from the traditions of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. What an amazing topic, right? Or they have one about the place of the intellect, or they have a book called The Children, Raising Children from Kitab and Sunnah. Right? This is a book that's available in English. It's a wonderful book. This is all the efforts of Darul Hadith, amazing institute. So one of the things they did is they produced a 14-volume encyclopedia called I forget the name of it right now, but it's a comprehensive encyclopedia of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Danish-Nameh Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And then part of that is the Shahadat Nameh of Imam Hussein, where it's of what happened to Imam Hussein alayhi salam and how he became Shaheed. And then similarly, we have a scholar who also recently just passed away, Sayyid Jafar Murtada Amili. He was a very special scholar who he would look at history and he would challenge it. He would say that he was known for this, that he would say that this history that we have, this was mostly, in many cases, for example, especially about the history of our Prophet, he's like, these books were mostly written by historians who were under the government of Khulafa who were Sunni, right? So we can't expect that they would go into all the history, especially those things that would be presenting the Shia perspective. And so he would oftentimes take a critical view of the narrative, this dominant Sunni narrative, especially when it came to history of our Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he did a really good job of making people question and try to see the other side, the reading between the lines on many things. So he also did a 24-volume work about Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Imagine 24 volumes about Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So here's a flow chart that where do you go to? So if you are looking just to like read for yourself, or let's say, I know that especially some of our sisters, they are asked to like recite a different majalis, especially during these times. Well, if you're looking for something that's brief, then you can go to Luhuf. If you're looking for something a bit more detail, then you go to Muntaha al-Amal and Nafasul Mahmum of Shaykh Abbas Qummi. But if you're doing a research paper, let's say we have university students or people who are intellectuals, they want to go into more detail, then you can go to these books. You first start at the oldest text, and then you go to the modern analysis based on these books right here. Okay. Now, we're going to look at an example. Now, this is the story of Hadrat Qasim ibn al-Hassan. As you know, this is one of the very tragic events that happened in Karbala because he was the son of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. He was young. He was very special. He was a person of ma'rifah. And the way he was martyred was described in a lot of detail. How was it described in a lot of detail? One of the reasons is because the enemy reporter, his name was Humayd. Humayd, he was watching what was happening and he didn't know who Qasim was. But there was something about the way Qasim approached the battlefield, the fact that he was just a child, the fact that his face was so bright that immediately it caught his attention. And he was just, he couldn't do anything. He just was watching this boy who's approaching, and he, to the level of detail where he notices, what kind of footwear he has. Imagine, right? In a battle, you don't look at these type of things, but he was noticing to that level of detail. So he described in detail for us what happened. Despite that, you see that throughout history, there have been some changes. Some of them maybe are, by mistake, and some of them are purposeful. And when it comes to today, right, in many cultures, the Hazrat Qasim alayhi salam is commemorated with certain special rituals and customs. And it's possible, or it's very likely, that some of those customs are based on these distortions or the mistakes that were introduced at a certain time. I'm going to explain in detail here. So this is from the history of Abu Mikhnaf, the early second century. We said this is, he actually interviewed people who were present in Karbala or who had seen Imam Hussein alayhi salam. What does he say? He says, Humayd ibn Muslim said, a young boy came out against us whose face was like a piece of the moon. He held a sword in his hand and was wearing a shirt, etc., and a pair of sandals. The strap of one of his sandals had broken, and I will never forget that it was the left one. Amr ibn Sa'd ibn Nufail said to me, by God, I'm going to attack him. I said to him, glory be to God. Why would you want to do that? Those whom you see surrounding him are enough for you. I mean, if you want to fight somebody, fight a man. Right? Why are you fighting a child? Then he says, no, by God, I'm going to attack him. He charged at him, and he did not turn away until he had struck him on the head with his sword. The boy fell forward upon his face and cried out, "Oh, my uncle." Okay? Now, if we just take that and we ask ourselves, who is this boy? He's the son of an imam, right? He is the orphan son of Imam Hassan. He's the one who was raised by Imam Hussein alayhi salam, right? And the fact that he's so brave, and the fact that he's going without armor, right? And how there's something about him that even that enemy soldier, says that I need to take him down. That's how much threatened they are by this child. That should be enough for somebody to cry, right? It should be enough for somebody to like just their heart to melt and to like just say that like, Ya Allah, like this was a tragedy, okay? But what we see, something's happened, right? So now, this is from Abu Mikhnaf. Now, this is from the Maqtal of Hussein of Khwarazmi. Khwarazmi was in 6th century. This is generally considered to be a good source by our great scholars, okay? And they rely upon it. They don't say that everything there is, we can take just like it's, from Allah, but it's generally considered to be a good source. So what does he say? I don't want to read the whole thing here, but notice here that he says that Qasim was a young boy who had not yet reached bulugh. Okay, so this is important. And then he says the story of how when Imam Hussein saw him, he embraced him and the two of them began to weep until both of them lost consciousness. And then the boy asked permission to fight, but his uncle refused to grant him permission. And the boy continued kissing his hands and feet and asking him for permission until he finally permitted him. He went out with tears flowing down his cheeks, reciting, and then he says, In tunkiruni fa'anabnul hasani. The famous lines of Hazrat Qasim alayhi salam, Hadal Husaynu kal murtahani, bayna unasin la suqu. These amongst people, Sawt al-Mazani, Sawb al-Mazani, thank you, that they should never be given any rain that should fall upon them. It's famous lines of Hazrat Qasim alayhi salam. Now, here you see there's a little bit more detail, okay? And this detail helps us, right? Even this scene of the Imam of the time embracing his nephew who's a child, and the two of them embracing, and it being such a deep moment that both of them lose consciousness. It's just amazing, okay? And you see that the Imam is hesitant to give him permission. And you ask yourself, well, is there a rational explanation behind that? You're like, of course, it makes sense, right? Because he's a kid, right? Who would let a kid go to the battlefield? And especially when Imam Hassan had asked Imam Hussein to take care of his children, then Imam Hussein must be thinking in his mind that I have this amana from my brother, and here I am, he's going to go to a battlefield where 100% he's going to be killed. So it makes sense. It's sad, it's profound, and it makes sense. So you see that scholars like Sayyid ibn Tawus, they included this narrative of Al-Khwarazmi in their maqtals. They said this is something that is acceptable to us. Now, let's go to Rawdat al-Shuhada. I talked about this yesterday. It was, the first Persian work that became very famous, and it had the effect of bringing a lot of people to the path of Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam. But one of the things that the author did is he took the history and he spun it into a story. Okay? And we don't have the things that he mentions in no book before him. Some of those things has ever these things been mentioned before. So I'll give you here, for example, it says that when Al-Qasim had read this testament, what testament is it? In his story, he says that Imam Hussein didn't want to let him go. He said, no, you can't go. So Qasim, was very disappointed. Then he thinks, and he's like, oh, there was a letter that my father gave me that I was supposed to take out at the time when I'm about to be killed. So he goes and he finds this letter, the testament, and then it says that, basically that give him permission to go. So he goes, he kisses the hand of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. When the Imam, or he kissed the testament, he placed it in the hand of Imam Hussein. When the Imam saw it, he cried and he said, "This is your father's testament. You wish to carry it out, but he gave me another instruction concerning you." He took Qasim by the hand, he brought him into the tent. He summoned Aun and Abbas. He told Al-Qasim's mother, "Dress Al-Qasim in new clothes." Then he said to his sister Zainab, "Bring the chest belonging to my brother Al-Hassan." She immediately brought it, she placed it before him. Imam Hussein opened the chest and dressed Qasim in Imam Hassan's robe and in another valuable garment. So first of all, he's taking time on the battlefield to dress Qasim alayhi salam in nice garments. And then he says he put a nice turban on his head, and then he took the hand of his daughter who had been betrothed, like they were engaged, for marriage purposes, and said that, "Oh Qasim, this is the trust your father committed to you. Until today she has remained with me. Now receive her." Imam Hussein then contracted the marriage between them, and then etc. And then Umar ibn Sa'd, somebody from the army, says, "Is there no champion remaining to come out against us?" So Qasim leaves his bride and says, "I have to go fight." Okay, and eventually then when he says that, what happens is that there's a cry that comes from the unseen world, a cry unlike any familiar human voice. "Well done, O time, well done, O earth. This is how you unite brides with bridegrooms?" And the bride says that, "Qasim, you say that our wedding has been postponed until the day of judgment, but on the day of judgment, where will I find you?" And she says that, he says, "Seek me beside my father and my grandfather and recognize me by this torn sleeve." And then the Ahlul Bayt begin to complain, and they say that, "Oh Qasim, what oppression and injustice is this? This is not the custom or practice of a wedding." So that's what, this narrative. Okay. Now, when we come to this, again, we don't want to say that just because something wasn't recorded in the early sources that it's false, because there's a possibility that it was passed along oral tradition, verbally one person to another. But our scholars, when they come to this, they say that, well, let's look at it and try to understand. Okay, would Imam Hussein alayhi salam do this on the day of Ashura? Right? Would the Ahlul Bayt complain and say that, "Oh Qasim, you're doing injustice"? Right? I mean, Qasim was from the Ahlul Bayt, and he was from the child. And Qasim was non-baligh, right? So how does this work then? If he was, let's say, 11 years old, how would we even, make sense of this story here? So this is where, our great scholars say that we have to be very careful when we go to our sources, right? Because again, there's a time when somebody wants to tell a story and they want to, let's say, for example, somebody wants to write a fictional story inspired by the events of Karbala. Then they could do that. They could take this and it actually sounds like a great story. And this was inspired. Okay. But that's different than saying this is the maqtal of what happened, in Karbala. Now, I want to give you another example from this. This is from Luhuf. We said Luhuf was written by which great scholar? Sayyid ibn Tawus, right? One of our greatest scholars. And this is a book that a lot of our marjas and great scholars had referred to this. So what does he say? He says, Imam Hussein swept down upon him as a falcon sweeps down and charged with the fury of an enraged lion. He struck Ibn Fudail with his sword. Ibn Fudail warded off the blow with his forearm, but Imam Hussein severed it at the elbow. He let out a cry. Who let out a cry? Ibn Fudail. That was heard by the people throughout the army. The Kufans then charged in order to rescue him. Who do they want to rescue him from? From Imam Hussein alayhi salam. But the horses trampled him until he perished. Who did the horses trample? Who? Ibn Fudail. Right? Do you see that? The horses trampled Ibn Fudail. They didn't trample Hazrat Qasim alayhi salam. They trampled Ibn Fudail. And the same thing is mentioned in the Tarikh of Tabari, in the Tarikh of Ibn Makhnaf, right? And the Tarikh of the Maqtal of Khwarizmi, and many of all the sources that came before a certain time. Now, what happens in Nawasik al-Tawarikh in 13th century, which was not that long ago, 13th century was maybe like 200, 150 years ago. The author of this book, he says he wrote it in Persian language. So he says the attacker let out a cry and withdrew from that place. The soldiers rallied together and launched an attack in order to rescue Amr from Imam Hussein's grasp. Amid the horsemen's charge, Qasim's body was flattened beneath the animal's hooves. Okay? When Imam Hussein, through repeated attacks, had dispersed the army, the dust settled, and the air over the battlefield became somewhat clear. Imam Hussein, peace be upon him, came and stood at Qasim's head. Qasim was still in the throes of death, scraping and rubbing the ground with his busted feet. Imam Hussein said, "By God, it is grievous for your uncle that you should call upon him and he should not answer you, or that he should answer you but his voice not be of benefit to you." So you see here that it's very similar, okay? But there's a key detail here that got changed. He says that it was Qasim's body that got trampled beneath the hooves, okay? This was not found before this. It was a relatively new understanding. Now, it could be that when he was translating the Arabic, in Arabic you use pronouns, and sometimes the pronoun, it's not in any language. If you say he or his, it could refer to this person or that person. And he just made a genuine mistake. But the problem is that when you look at this logically, right, if it's the case that, God forbid, Hazrat Qasim's body was trampled beneath the animal's hooves, how could Imam Hussein go and then talk to him right afterwards? Right? It doesn't make sense in terms of how it flows, right? And not only that, right, it says that amidst the horsemen's charge, they came to in order to rescue Amr. Amid the horsemen's charge, Qasim's body was flattened beneath the animal's hooves. The flow doesn't really make sense because it's talking about saving Amr, and suddenly it talks about Qasim. So you can see here that it's very, very likely he just made a mistake, but this mistake was then taken and translated, and even in English, one of the most common referred to sources in English that you find like on alislam.org and other websites that a lot of people go to, a lot of people become Shia because of this text. I know the person who actually compiled this book. He passed away maybe about 15, 20 years ago. May Allah have mercy on him. But he put the same thing in that book as well too. The Hazrat Qasim's body was trampled by the hooves of the enemy army. Okay, so this was a mistake then, and then you have a lot of like say poetry and other traditions that depend and rely on this being there. Okay, so inshallah, when if we get a chance, then tomorrow, if Allah gives us tawfiq, then we want to start covering this topic. And once again, if you weren't here at the beginning and you wanted to get a copy of the slides, you can scan this QR code and you can get access to all the slides that we presented today. I wanted to, as I wind up my comments, I wanted to make a request for a Surah Al-Fatiha, and this request is for the marhumin of the sponsors of tonight's program, and especially for the marhumin of the Sagarwala and Mirza family. For them, for those marhumin and your marhumin and marhumat, please convey the thawab of a Surah Al-Fatiha after a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And also, there is a special request for dua of shifa for a sister who is pregnant. She's in the hospital right now, and there are some complications, and so she's asking for the dua of our community. Inshallah, you can join me by reciting Amma Yujib 5 times. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. أَمَّن يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ 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 On these last moments of the Friday evening, I want to send our salam to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you, O Imam Hussein, and upon the Shuhada of Karbala. Hazrat Qasim alayhi salam was still alive when Imam Hussein comes to him. But the pain in his body was so much that they say that his legs were hitting the ground out of that pain. Imam Hussein alayhi salam says to him, "O my nephew, how difficult it is for me to see you in this state and for you to call upon me and for me not to be able to answer you. But let us for a moment remember the martyrdom of Imam Hussein's own son Ali Akbar alayhi salam. When Ali Akbar was lying on the ground, Imam Hussein comes to him. He puts his cheek on his cheek. He says, "After you, O Ali Akbar, this world is no longer worth living in." But there's no conversation at that time with Imam Hussein and Ali Akbar. Why is that the case? Because right before that, when the enemy realized that it was Imam Hussein's son who had fallen from the horse, they all took their swords. And what did they do then? فَقَتَلُوا إِرْبًا إِرْبًا. They all took their swords and they attacked Ali Akbar together. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. We ask Allah Ta'ala to accept these efforts and these majalis and to help us be those who truly mourn for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And through this mourning we gain closeness to Allah and closeness to the Ahlul Bayt, and we distanced ourselves from the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt and their practices. We ask Allah to hasten the reprints of the Imam of the time and to help all those who are under injustice right now among the mu'mineen, those who are suffering in Islamic Republic of Iran, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and everywhere else. We ask Allah to help them and grant them steadfastness and victory with the barakah wa salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
اللهم صل على